afternoon. Thank you very much for the opportunity to present. This is a paper that was jointly written with Rasha Hassan from the Population Council on the associations between economic vulnerability and health and well-being in Egypt. So just briefly to outline what I'm going to talk about today, the health section, as Dr. Raghi mentioned yesterday, is one of those that has been expanded significantly in the ELMPS 2018. Yes. This screen is not working. Okay. I'm sorry, I don't know how to fix that one. It's working here, yes, okay. Okay. So this expansion of the health module has opened up a range of new opportunities for very policy relevant research. So I'm going to give just a brief overview of conceptually how we think about the linkages between economic vulnerability and health. I'll give a quick description of some of the new health and well-being measures in the ELMPS 2018, and then I'm going to show our results specifically as related to the new measures of disability and subjective well-being. Is it okay? Oh. There are a number of other measures that are included in the survey, but in the interests of time, I'm going to focus on these two. So economic vulnerability and health. The World Health Organization defines health as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. So the inclusion of social well-being and physical and mental dimensions in this definition, which dates from 1948, already gives us some indication of the degree to which health is intricately tied to other dimensions of our lives. And there's a growing field of study on what we call the social determinants of health, or the aspects of our social and economic and living conditions that have profound impacts on health, as well as inequalities in health across a population. There's been a lot of recent, very foundational work by the WHO and the Lancet Commission on the social determinants of health. That have included a number of dimensions of economic vulnerability that we've been talking about over the past 2 days, including poverty, employment conditions, economic inequality above and beyond poverty, and living and housing conditions. So our objective in this paper was to link some of the analyses that have been done in other chapters and in other dimensions of work on the ELMPS in relation to measures of economic vulnerability with these new measures that we now have about vulnerability on the dimension of health. The study of health and economic vulnerability, however, is complicated by reverse causality. So I would like to sort of caution everyone that the results we're presenting here are descriptive. But this is a really important basis for future work because the relationships between health and economic vulnerability are very complex. So we have the fact both that poor economic outcomes can contribute to poor health. For example, there are a wide variety of health outcomes that are more prevalent among people living in poverty for a variety of reasons. But at the same time, poor health can lead to worse economic outcomes. For example, people who are suffering from health problems may have difficulties participating in the labor market or maintaining jobs. And this can lead to negative shocks that affect households, even households that are otherwise economically secure. And I think this is particularly in context, important in the context of Egypt, as we saw this morning, given substantial gaps in social protection, and particularly the fact that the vast majority of the population is not covered by health insurance, which significantly reduces households' ability to cope with negative health shocks in a manner that may not influence negatively on other dimensions of the household. And in addition, we have to keep in mind that the relationship between economic and health outcomes often depends on other factors, a very important one of which is gender, another focus of our conference over these 2 days. So for example, in the case of Egypt, it's been shown in previous literature that unemployment has negative impacts on the mental health of men, but not so much on the mental health of women. And this may relate also to expectations around the gendered roles in the labor market. So with those caveats on causality in mind, I will present the two very exciting new measures that we have in the ELMPS. So whereas previous rounds of the ELMPS inquired about disability with a single question measure of do you have a disability, recent work around measurement of disability has shown that this question tends to produce quite substantial underestimations of disability, both because people may not understand limitations they have as disabilities, and because there's a lot of stigma attached to the word disability itself, particularly mental disabilities. So the ELMPS 2018, like the Egyptian Census 2017, which we will compare to, has adopted the UN Washington Group on Disability Statistics measure, which captures data on functional limitations in 6 domains. So we can also, with this measure, differentiate between different types of disability in the domains of sight, hearing, mobility, so walking and climbing stairs, remembering and concentrating, self-care, so ability to wash yourself, to get dressed, these sorts of daily activities, and communication, which is the ability to communicate with others in your normal language of communication without difficulty. And individuals are asked about, in these 4 domains, whether they have no difficulty at all, some difficulty, a lot of difficulty, or are completely unable to do the task. So this also allows us to adopt a functional approach to disability, which recognizes that disability is not only a characteristic of individuals, but it's about the relationship between individuals and our environment. So when certain accommodations, such as seeing glasses, something as simple as that, are available to people, disabilities may not limit their ability to participate in society to the same extent. So from these 6 domains, we construct several different measures. I'm going to focus on 2. The broad definition of disability captures an individual who has at least some difficulty in at least one of the 6 domains. So this is the widest group of disabled. The narrow definition captures only individuals who cannot perform at all tasks, at least in one of the 6 categories. And then there's a medium definition of individuals who have at least some, or a lot of difficulty, in one domain. The other measure I'm going to focus on is the WHO-5 Subjective Wellbeing Scale. So this is a scale composed of 5 measures, which you can see on the right of the screen. 5 positively phrased measures, such as, in the past week, I have felt cheerful and in good spirits. And people are asked to rate on a 5-point scale whether they have felt this way from none of the time to all of the time. This yields a scale that ranges from 0, minimal well-being, to 100, which is maximal well-being. Subjective well-being. A score of less than 50 is typically used in the literature to indicate poor well-being, and we follow this convention in our analysis. At lower cutoff points, the scale has actually been validated as a proxy for clinical depression, but we're not using that particularly, that cutoff point today. So our analysis, again, I would just like to emphasize that these are correlations between health outcomes and measures of vulnerability along socio-demographic characteristics or structural vulnerabilities, poverty, and employment characteristics. We do focus on the working age population, age 15 to 64, somewhat less so for disability, because the focus here is on economic and employment vulnerability, and we disaggregate our analyses by sex. So turning to results, when we look at the disability rates by the different definitions and sex for the Egyptian population aged 5 and above, we did find a higher disability rate according to all 3 measures than the Census 2017. The 2017 census, using the same measure, found a disability rate of about 10% among men and women using the broad definition, 2.5% using the medium definition, and 0.5% using the narrow definition, which shows us, so previous measures in the ELMPS 2012 had with a single question measure produced a disability rate of about 2.3%. So we can see that's sort of most comparable to the medium definition. In the ELMPS, we actually got a higher rate of 16.6% using the broad definition and almost 1% using the narrow, 5%, just under 5% using the medium. This is produced by 2 specific domains, specifically vision and mobility. We're not entirely sure why this is. We're going to delve into it more. The census, I think, did capture a slightly younger population than the ELMPS, if I remember Caroline correctly, but we need to look at the distribution by age groups. But either way, this does demonstrate that the single question measures of disability have been dramatically underestimating disability rates, and that there is quite a substantial burden of disability among the population that needs to be taken into consideration. Disability, as we may expect, along all domains tends to increase with age, which is a particularly important point for Egypt and other countries in the region that are aging. So if we look, for example, this is just one example, the others follow the same pattern of difficulty in walking or climbing stairs. We can see that even by the end of the working ages in the late 50s and early 60s, about 25% of men and 40% of women report that they have at least some difficulty performing this task. So the rates, of course, are much younger among young people, but still, even among the youth, we're seeing rates of 2 to 3%, particularly around vision and walking. So these are factors that need to be taken into consideration in terms of labor market participation. If we look at disability rates using the broad definition, which is what I'm going to follow from here on because the narrow definition gives us a very small sample size, by poverty indicators, we see, as is commonly found in other contexts as well, that disability rates are higher, particularly among the lowest quintile. We have to remember that this could go both ways. It could be poverty contributing to disability. It could also be disability contributing to poverty because people are less able to produce income. When we break this down, we did this by rural and urban poor because we found actually a higher rate of disability in urban areas. This is likely related to the fact that the urban population is older. But we see in both urban areas and rural areas, respectively, the poor population has a higher rate of disability than the non-poor population. So we have a steady gradient from the urban poor to the rural non-poor. And then looking at the overlap of disability with the food security measure that Iman and Rania presented this morning, we see, again, higher rates of disability, progressively higher rates of disability among the progressively more food insecure. And this is likely an indicator of some of the overlapping vulnerabilities related to poverty, in that food insecure households tend to be poor and also tend to suffer from a higher burden of disability, which I think is important for us to consider in terms of thinking about the multiple needs of the most vulnerable households. Turning to employment, we see somewhat contrasting patterns for men and women, and again, I would like to emphasize that this is not causal. Whereas among women, we actually see higher rates of disability among the employed. This is likely a product of the fact that the employed population is older than the unemployed and out of the labor force population of women, because younger women, as we saw yesterday, have lower labor force participation rates. Whereas among men, in contrast, who are more likely to work throughout the life course, we see somewhat lower rates of employment among those who have a disability by both definitions, which may be an indication of some of the difficulty that men with disabilities have in entering the labor market or finding jobs. So turning to well-being, this is the summary score by age group for the well-being index. And so what we see throughout the life course is sort of a steady decline in self-reported subjective well-being by age. There's a slight advantage among women at younger ages that turns to a slight disadvantage by older ages, but a steady progression with age, which makes sense in some respects, as sort of mental health is very closely related to physical health, and as we've seen, physical health tends to deteriorate with age. It may, however, also be related to social and other factors. When we use the cutoff point of 50, we find that 45% of the Egyptian population aged 15 and above reports low subjective well-being using this measure. It's remarkably similar for men and women. It's about 8.8 percentage points difference. So almost half of the population. Turning to some of the determinants of low well-being, the rest of the graphs I'm going to present show the percentage of people who report low subjective well-being according to the measure rather than the score, which is a little bit difficult to interpret sometimes. One of the key determinants that emerged is marital status, particularly among women. And as we can see from the graph, divorced women in particular, 64% are more likely to report low subjective well-being, which is likely related to a wide variety of social and economic factors. The widowed women also tend to report higher rates of low well-being. Part of this is due to age. We can see the never married have the best well-being, so if you're thinking about getting married, maybe think twice. And then part of this, though, is related to age. And then among the married, we see slightly higher levels of well-being among men than among women. But marital status, especially being divorced among women across our health measures, was something that consistently came up as a predictor of poorer health outcomes. Again, the relationship between mental and physical health, as we maybe would expect, we see that regardless of the measure of disability, as well as the measure of whether the individual has a long-standing or chronic illness that we have as well in the LMPS, we see that individuals with chronic health problems or disability report lower subjective well-being, which is in some extent just a relationship of health, but I think also, again, points to the need to think about accommodations in terms of quality of life for persons with disabilities or other health issues. Turning to poverty, we again see the same relationship we saw with disability in many ways, that there are poor health outcomes among the urban population and especially the urban poor. We see higher rates of low well-being among the urban population. And again, a steady gradient sort of declining from the urban poor to the rural non-poor. Low well-being is particularly high in Cairo. The rates of low well-being in Cairo among the non-poor are nearly 60%. Among the Cairo poor, this is Greater Cairo, the three governorates, Al-Ubayya, Giza, and Cairo. We see 60% among men and 76% of poor women, this is Q1 and Q2 in Greater Cairo, report low levels of subjective well-being, which I think, again, raises a lot of questions about urbanization and the urban environment, access to basic necessities in urban areas that require further thinking. And again, as we saw with the more physical health measure, we can see that among the more food insecure, we see somewhat higher rates of low subjective well-being, which may also be related to some of the anxieties around food sufficiency. Turning to household shocks, which again were discussed this morning. We're following the same definitions of social health, economic, and natural shocks that were presented by Ayman in the morning. And I think the question of what do these shocks actually mean for households came up. And again, we can't establish causality, but indicatively we do see that among households, particularly that experienced health and social shocks, but also to a degree economic shocks, if we compare to that population rate of 45% experiencing low well-being, households that experienced all types of shocks except natural, the household members were more likely to experience low rates of well-being. So this may be some indication of the multiple numbers of factors among households that experience shocks that are then contributing to health and particularly mental health outcomes. And then finally, looking at the employed, what we see is what we would sort of expect in terms of the relationship between job quality and well-being. The relationship between employment or not and type of employment is not as consistent across categories. It varies quite a bit by gender. But when we look at those who are employed, we see that those who have suffered a work injury, those who report being exposed to a greater number of hazards in their workplace, and those who report being dissatisfied with their jobs, which again, as presented was yesterday, correlates quite strongly with our objective measures of job quality, tend to report higher levels of poor subjective well-being. So I think this is an important indication of some of the other health perhaps unseen in many ways, health consequences of poor job quality. So just to summarize some of the main findings, we find that around 1 in 6 working age individuals in Egypt has some level of disability using the Washington Group measure. Again, this is slightly higher than the census, but either way it points to the huge importance of accommodations, both in education. We have colleagues who have done some very nice papers on the barrier that disability poses to education of young people, but also to the ability of people with some form of disability to participate in the labor market, which is critical in the working age population in particular, which is really critical for avoiding other forms of economic vulnerability related to the inability to participate in paid employment. So this is a very important policy point. We do find a high burden of low subjective well-being. Unfortunately, there are very few other studies in the region to compare this measure to. The ELMPS is one of the first data sets that's collected it. However, there was a study in Palestine in 2012, a nationally representative survey as well, that collected the WHO-5, and they found that about 33% of the population experienced low well-being using the same cutoff. So Egypt is 12 percentage points higher. And again, the reasons for this are multiple, but it's something that deserves further exploration. And then overall, our findings also with the other measures we looked at in the paper show a consistent association between poor health and economic vulnerability, which we see also, of course, in the international literature, and then points to specific groups that suffer from overlapping structural and economic vulnerabilities that may be in need of particular attention in terms of addressing these vulnerabilities on health and socioeconomic dimensions. Some of these groups include divorced women, the elderly population, and particularly women who are widowed, the urban poor, and again, particularly women who are urban poor, and then people who are engaged in low-quality employment. Thank you.